Welcome everyone to Do As I Say, Authenticity and the Research Process. I am really excited to have you all here today. My name is Jane Hammonds. I am an associate professor in the university libraries at The Ohio State University. I am the Teaching and Learning Engagement Librarian. You can feel free to email me at hammonds.73@osu.edu, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about anything that I am talking about today. Today, we're going to explore the idea of authenticity in teaching and think about authenticity in relation to how we might be teaching the research process. We'll think about what some of the factors might be that might impact our ability to be authentic when teaching, and we'll identify strategies very broadly defined for thinking about how we can be more authentic when we teach. I want to acknowledge that this presentation was inspired by a presentation that I attended at the Lilac Information Literacy Conference in Leeds in April of 2024. That presentation was Never Have I Ever Used Google Scholar, Hypocrisy and Authenticity in Library and Academic Skills Teaching, presented by Rachel Davies and Joe Larkin, both from Leeds Beckett University. I went to that session, I loved it, and I immediately went up to them and said, I want to do a workshop on this for my audience. Do you all mind? And thankfully they were open to doing that. So the session is inspired by that. There is a link to their slides on the screen if you would like to see those. But mine does go in some different directions. So it's not the same presentation. So I would encourage you to take a look at theirs as well. But I do pull some things from their presentation over in. I wanted to emphasize that we're not necessarily talking about creating authentic assignments here or creating authentic learning experiences. That's related, but it's not the main focus of what we're talking about today. We're thinking more about what it means to be authentic in terms of us as teachers and how we think about and talk about the research process. Some of what I say may seem controversial to some folks. Just want to make it clear that my goal is not to criticize how anyone is teaching, but just to encourage some discussion on this topic. And I wanted to have a confession, right, that I'm still learning about this topic. I'm definitely not an expert on the idea of authenticity in teaching. I've done some reading on it. As often happens, the more I've read about it, the more confusing the topic becomes. And the more difficult it is to kind of make sense of it all as you start to learn more. And so I don't really think I'm going to have very clear, strong answers for everyone on this topic about exactly what it means to be authentic in teaching, because as I started to investigate it, it got a lot more complicated. So that will be kind of left up to you, I think, in the end to decide what it means to you to be an authentic teacher and how you go about teaching the research process authentically. So hopefully today, though, will give us some great things to talk about and consider as we're thinking about what it means to be an authentic teacher or to teach research in an authentic manner. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in here. This is a slide from a presentation that I gave just this week on Tuesday to graduate students here at Ohio State. And one of the things that I was talking about with them is how they can find databases, articles, and journals. As you look at this slide, you see that the first thing that I tell them to use is to use Discover to search across multiple library platforms. So Discover is, of course, the library sort of main search box. When you go to the main library website and search, that's our discovery tool that kind of tries to search across all of the resources that we have. So this is an example of a presentation that I gave. And then here's my confession. I would never start to search for information by going to the Discover search box first. I very heavily rely on Google Scholar when I am starting to search for information. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't ever use the library website or use library resources, but I do not use the Discover tool as my first search tool. I think I generally find the results to be pretty frustrating. And so I will use Google Scholar. I'll get an idea of what I might be looking for. And then I can go in and I go to a specific database where I know that the article that I'm looking for is, or then I may use the catalog to search for specific books that, whether we have those books. but using the Discover tool as the first step in the search process is not something that I do. And yet, this is what I told students to do. So that's one example of a confession that I have when it comes to searching for information, one part of the research process. So Google Scholar is my go-to tool when I start to search for anything. A few other examples of confessions that I have. As a librarian, right, I can say that, we often as librarians teach students to develop search statements, and we teach them to be very careful using Boolean operators and, and, or, not, and how to use those effectively. And I rarely ever use them when I'm searching. One of my colleagues, she might be here today, Cheryl, if you are, hi, asked me to review from some guidance for students on how to do multiple operator searches, and I got it wrong, right? Because I just don't do these searches. So those are two examples of confessions that I have. Thinking more broadly about my search habits or my research habits, we often teach students to look at a variety of different, platforms to find news sources, so that they can get a broader perspective. I get the vast majority of my news from Reddit, right? I talked to some of my colleagues about some potential confessions that they might have. And one colleague, indicated that she almost always uses citation mining to find sources rather than developing a search statement. Yes, in advance, one scholar admitted, citing Wikipedia in her professional work, right? So these are some examples of confession. And so, yeah, the question in there was, what is Discovery? That's basically, yes, it's Ohio State's sort of multi-platform search tool. So it's the main search box that you see on the library website, and it basically tries to search it searches the catalog, searches databases, try to search everything at once. Right. So those are some confessions that I have, and some confessions that my colleagues have shared. So I'd love to hear it if you feel comfortable sharing any confessions that you have. So I'll put a link there in the chat. You should see a link to a Padlet there. So basically, what I'd like to hear from you is thinking very broadly about what it means to do research. You can think, I know some of you are librarians, but others of you are instructors who may be teaching research in a very different way. If you're teaching empirical research processes. So thinking about how you teach research, how you might, what confessions that you have. So what do you tell students to do that you don't actually do yourself? So we have a Padlet. And what you can do is here, over here on the left-hand side, hopefully folks should be seeing the Padlet, is where something you can share your confessions here. So if you click this plus sign here, that will allow you to type your response up there. And if you feel comfortable, again, only if you feel comfortable, share any confessions that you might have. If you're not able to access the Padlet or you'd rather just share in the chat, you can do that as well. I'll put the link in the Padlet one more time there as well. See some other folks talking about not being fond of discovery searches as well. Yeah. So we have some confessions coming in. I use Google first every single time. So for patent searching, the tools from the USPTO are awful. I actively tell students to use other tools like Lens or Google Patents. I almost never take the time to develop carefully considered search term strings. Yep. I select full text always. I depend on one media source, NPR, and assume its credibility in nearly all cases, but I teach media lateral reading. I use Google first as well. I also use Instagram for most news, but I do verify it. So lots of folks saying that they use Google, they use Wikipedia. Citation management. I know Zotero is powerful, but I am an old school citation manager and prefer manually creating citations. Yep. So much Googling, using ChatGPTs. I do not make a list of keywords. Same. I've written an article before and had that trouble where they asked me to say what I had searched for, and I'm like, I have no idea what I searched for. I just search the first thing that comes into my head, frequently use Wikipedia, use AI tools. I love using AI, but I tell them not to do that because it's not always reliable, right? Citation management, brainstorming. I never tell students to pirate things, but I always do. Yep. Yeah. My search strategy is trial and error, searching Google, Wikipedia first, right? So I'm glad to see, of course, that I am not alone in the fact that often the things that I tell students to do or that I have in the past told students to do doesn't really align with what I actually do. So thank you all for sharing those confessions. Let's see if we've got any other ones here. Writing citations by hand. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So thank you. Yeah. So I wanted to use that as a way to get into this idea of thinking about what it means to teach in an authentic manner. What does authenticity in teaching mean? What does an authentic teacher do? What does an inauthentic teacher do? Is it better that we are more authentic, or are there, reasons why we might not be as authentic as maybe we would like to be? Or so we're going to look into this issue of what it means to be authentic in teaching and what that might mean for potential benefits, potential harms, potential challenges associated with that. So I wanted to share some different definitions of authenticity, or some different descriptions of what it means to be authentic in teaching. And I will say right from the start, there's no agreement necessarily in the scholarly literature on exactly what it means to be an authentic teacher. It's often taken for granted that it is a good thing to be an authentic teacher, but what exactly that means is not always clear. And as I'll mention in a little bit, even the idea that authenticity is always a good thing has received some pushback as well. So one aspect of authenticity that has been highlighted is basically like caring about our students, right? I'm going to assume most of you, because that you are here, you're taking the time to learn more about this topic in teaching. I believe that everyone is here cares about their students. And so I don't think that this aspect of authenticity is one that we necessarily have to be concerned with. There may be some, maybe some folks who feel that way, but for the most part, I think the fact that we are here and talking about this topic and interested in learning about this and doing better first, like we want to do better for our students. We want to be good teachers. We want to support them. So I think that aspect of authenticity is one that I'm going to, for the most part, assume that we all have. But beyond that, what does it mean to be authentic as a teacher? So there's been some different descriptions or definitions of different aspects or factors of what it means to be authentic in teaching. Some of these have been around the idea of sort of practicing what we preach, right? So making sure that our behaviors are congruent with our words. So if this is what we say, this is what we do, or this is what we actually believe, right? So not telling our students to do one thing or telling our students this, but behaving in a different way ourselves. So practicing what we preach, one example of potentially what it means to be authentic as a teacher. Some additional examples. So we already mentioned like consistency between values and actions. In some cases, authenticity is described as presenting your genuine self to your audience. So being who you really are, letting your students know who you really are. Another aspect of that could be that you are teaching based on your own expectations, your own understanding of what is to be done, rather than being defined by others' expectations. So you're teaching something because you really believe in it, rather than that other people expect that you would be teaching this. That you have perhaps taken the time to reflect on certain practices, and you're not just sort of repeating the same practices that you learned or that others do, but you're actually thinking about the norms, the practices, and making decisions yourself about the best way to teach. Acting in the best interest of the students. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this as we go through, but one aspect of authenticity in teaching that has been described has been this, that what you are doing, you're doing because you feel it is, you genuinely feel it is in the best interest of the students. And that what you are doing is promoting authenticity in students themselves. So those are some definitions or descriptions. So authenticity in teaching is often has been related to being sincere, being candid, being honest with your students, such as being able to say, no, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure, being able to admit that there's something that you don't know. As we already talked about, this idea of consistency, being true to yourself. So not performing, not acting, but just being your genuine self. Although sort of small caveat there that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to tell everything about yourself, that you have to have complete disclosure, but you shouldn't be lying about who you are necessarily. And then there's this idea of having sort of a genuine interest in what you're teaching, and displaying that interest and enthusiasm to your students. But that has to be balanced with this idea that we recognize that we can't always only teach what we're interested in, that there are some things that our students do need to know about it. And even if we may not really enjoy teaching about those things, we recognize that those are things that our students need to know. And so we're going to teach them to our students, even if we would much rather be talking about something else. So as I mentioned, one of these, the key factors that has been brought up has been this idea of an authentic teacher is one that acts in the best interest of their students. Sometimes this could mean that you are breaking the rules. Or you're going against convention, that this is supposed to be teaching them, but I actually don't think it's that in their best interest to do so. So I'm going to teach them something different. But it's also important to recognize that that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to just teach students what they want to hear or what they want to learn, right? We know that there are going to be topics that our students are not going to be interested in. As a librarian, right, students generally don't get all that excited about learning about citations, but right, because we think that that's something really important for them to learn, we are going to teach it. So we're not going to just go with what the consumer wants, but we're going to use our own expertise to identify what it is that they need to know. So with all of those definitions in mind, what does it mean then to be an authentic teacher? Inauthentic teacher, right? So that could involve being inconsistent or hypocritical. It could involve concealing the truth, potentially, teaching things even though you don't really believe in them or you don't really care about them, or in some way putting on some type of performance. Or it could be, I'm going to follow these rules, even if I don't believe in them, even if I don't think it's right. That's what the rule is. That's what I'm going to do. So as you've probably heard all of this, you may have already gotten the idea that it's actually really complicated to identify what might be considered authenticity in teaching. Some of these don't always work well against each other, right? Being really honest maybe is not always going to be in the best interest of your students. Maybe there is a case in which being dishonest is actually what is in the best interest of your students. So it's not exactly always very clear cut or easy to determine exactly what it means when we talk about authenticity in teaching. So I have an example here that I wanted to share. And this is one that will be familiar to the librarians in the group. But librarians often are called upon to provide database demonstrations. And many a librarian, including myself, have gone into a classroom with a pre-prepared search, right? We've practiced this search. We know it works. We know it's going to get the results that we want to show. Is this an example of being an inauthentic teacher? Because I'm not really being honest about how complicated it can be to use these tools sometimes. I make it seem really easy because the search I did worked because I practiced it in advance and I knew that it worked. So is that an example of being an inauthentic teacher, or is that just being practical? right? I have a very limited amount of time. I can't, spend a lot of time doing searches that don't work with my students, right? So, I don't think there's a clear-cut answer there. But that's, one example of how challenging it might be to think about this topic. Right? Got some folks saying in there saying it depends, right? Yeah, and some folks are saying, yeah, and I think a lot of folks have moved away from the prepared search, which is something that I agree with, but it's definitely something that I have done many times in the past, and I'm sure a lot of librarians, even if they don't do that anymore, have done in the past, for sure. Okay. So I did want to mention, as I said, as I got more into this topic, it becomes more and more complex. So there have been some concerns raised about these descriptions of authenticity that I went through, that the authors that we were looking at have been conflating other things like sincerity or honesty with authenticity, and that those don't actually mean the same thing. So Lauren Bialstock, for example, argues that in the strictest sense, to be authentic is to live in alignment with one's own identity, to be the most me that I can be. But she argues that that does not necessarily mean that you are consistent, or that I'm going to go back. Oh, sorry, I went too far. Or that you are a good person. Maybe someone's authentic self is actually a dishonest person. Right? So, and there's also, as she talks about, it's kind of assumed among a lot of educators that being more authentic is a good thing. But there's necessarily no correlation that being authentic is going to make you a better teacher or create a better educational situation, she argues. So, this topic it's really complex to identify how exactly we're defining authenticity. And if it is just about being your true self, or is there something more to that? Do the other descriptions that folks have had around sincerity and honesty actually mean that you are being authentic? All right. So I'm going to check really quickly to see. I've got lots of comments in the chat. See if we have any questions in there. Some folks talking about prepared searches. Yeah. Doing plan searches and then have. Yeah. So yes, it's interesting. We've seen a discussion in there where some folks are like, I never do prepared searches. Other folks like, no, you're wasting time if the example doesn't work. Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely it's a balance. Yeah, so even among this group, right? So it's not really clear exactly what it means. So I was going to do this as a poll, but since we're already running out of time, going back to the situation that I mentioned at the very beginning, where I said that I tell students to go to use our Discover system, but I don't use it myself. With that situation in mind, thinking about these descriptions of authenticity that we've been talking about, am I being authentic if I tell students to use the Discovery system, even though it's something that I rarely use myself and don't really think is the best option for students? So I'd love to hear your response, and if you just feel comfortable in the chat. Do you think that I am being authentic or inauthentic if I am telling students to do that? So got some different responses here. I would say no, because I think it's a flawed approach. Some folks are saying I'm being inauthentic. Right, but not necessarily. You're meeting students where they are in their research skills. Not completely unauthentic. Searching is also context is dependent. Yeah. It depends. Context and their experience. Competency is important. Julie says neither. You're giving them a starting point. Sharing the tool is authentic. Saying it's the best, maybe inauthentic. I think it depends on how you word it. Yeah. Brooklyn shared, yeah, if you're telling them specifically not to use Google, then it would be unauthentic. Yeah, so it definitely depends on context, what else I might be telling them, how exactly I describe it, what I'm telling them it could be used for, or when they would want to use it versus not. Yeah, so it depends a lot, as folks are pointing out, on the context, right? So folks have already answered this one. So I went through and kind of and tried to think to myself and looked at some of these descriptions of things that I'm doing. Am I practicing what I preach? No, not really, right? This is not how I would ever go about doing a search myself. Am I being sincere, candid, or honest? I don't tell them generally about my concerns that I have about this system. Part of that is due to time, context. I have a lot of resources to cover in a very short amount of time. And then there's also the concern, do I really want to be out there bashing a product that my library, has? That maybe not the best, may not be the impression that I want to share with students. So I'm not really being all that candid or honest. Am I demonstrating care for students, as some folks said in the chat? It may be, right? If I'm telling them this because, I want to think about where they are in their research process, letting them know the range of tools that are available to them, right? There may be situations when they find that tool really helpful, right? So I do think that I'm demonstrating care. Am I being defined by my own expectations? Maybe I'm teaching this because I think that's what I should tell students about, because I'm a librarian at Ohio State and I should tell them to use Ohio State resources. Am I acting in the best interest of the students? Maybe, right? On the one hand, as I said, it could be valuable for them to learn about this tool. It really could. But it could also be very frustrating for them to use this tool. And if sort of that's their first experience using the library, that may actually, lead them to not use other library resources if the first tool that they try doesn't really work all that well. So I think it's really complicated, as I was going through and trying to decide, what this actually meant for myself. I wasn't really able to come to a clear answer to myself. So let's see if we got lots of comments in the chat. I love all the comments are coming through. So Jamie shared, sometimes authenticity can lead to negativity, and then that can spiral into, why are you showing me this at all? That's a great point. I think I'm going to mention that again a little bit later on, Jamie. So then I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on what are the reasons we may be less than authentic when we are teaching. So if folks wanted to share on the Padlet again, their thoughts on what is something that might lead you or might, lead others to maybe not be as authentic as we perhaps would like to be or should be when we are teaching. So on this center column here, if you want to you can go ahead and click that plus, right? So what are some of the reasons that we may be less than authentic when we are teaching? So some of the responses coming in, so simplifying, right? Sometimes to simplify the research process for students, we may not mention best practices. We may take shortcuts for the process of efficiency, not overwhelming the students. Yeah, absolutely. Time constraints, yeah. Putting yourself in the shoes of the students. Yes, it's easier to learn a recipe for research before developing individual modifications that work for you. Yep. Absolutely. Instructor expectations. Yes. Time constraints. Pressure from a governing board for a certain train of thought. Yes. Yeah, that's great. This is what I was taught, so therefore I should also teach this. Yep. So, we have all of these expectations about how we should be teaching, what we should be teaching, what this process should look like, right? Sometimes we just can't share an honest opinion. Yep. And there could be many, many reasons why we feel that I just can't share and say exactly what I want. right? We know the benefits and weaknesses, so we're making informed choices when we use alternatives. Students won't have the best practice understanding unless we teach it. Yeah, great. Thank you all so much for sharing those responses. Those are great. Let me go ahead and go back to our presentation here. So some of the potential factors that could influence authenticity, many of these are ones that folks mentioned. Maybe I have a lack of experience or confidence in myself as a teacher, and so having a very clear right method or process to teach is easier or more manageable for me, right? And maybe it's only after we become more experienced and feel more comfortable that we would feel able to go off script a little bit. Maybe as someone put in the comments there, this is how it's always been taught, so this is how I'm going to teach it. And we don't really take the time to think about whether it actually is in our students' best interest to teach it this way. Credibility, maybe we, in our role as instructors, our role as librarians, whatever position we are in, if you're a graduate teaching associate, right, we want to demonstrate our expertise. We want to establish that. And so showing this more formal, specific structure may be a way that we feel that we are establishing our credibility as a teacher. Some folks had mentioned professional practice, professional pressure, institutional pressure, right? So we may feel that we have to align with the best practices that are in our field, or here's how everyone in the field teaches this. Here's how other people in our library teach this. We want to align with the decisions, right? The discovery system is a product, that our library offers. And so I need to be showing that I am supporting our library, right? There was a great quote in one of the articles I read, right? That this person was talking about doing sessions on different databases and really thinking that the only reason I'm showing them this is because we're paying for these. And so we feel like we have to tell them about these things, right? So there's a lot of potential factors. There's a lot of potential pressure. We may just not feel that we are in a situation where we can be honest, or we just may not be comfortable doing so. And again, it may be, we may be feeling that it's actually, it's not in the best interest of our students, to be honest. Someone mentioned, like sometimes you need to learn the rules before you can break the rules, right? And so students need to have this structure. We need to give them this structure, and then they can figure it out on their own once they've had a little practice, but they need this guidance first from us. Right? So pause here to see if there are any other factors that folks would like to raise that they think may lead us to be less than authentic. I didn't mention time in there, but of course that is one as well, that a lot of folks mentioned on the Padlet as being like, even if we are teaching full semester classes and we're not teaching just a one-shot session that librarians often teach, right? If we spend too much time showing them things that don't work or kind of going off, like, we have to show them what works so we can get them through the class. Let's see. Yeah, research requirements. Yeah, especially if you're those folks that are in librarian positions that are teaching based on requirements that faculty members give them or instructors give them. Sometimes there's disagreement, right? That maybe the assignment is not the best assignment in the world, right? But we feel that we can't say that for many reasons. Yeah, Michael, just want to stay with what's safe so I won't look bad. Yes, I think that's a great point. All right, so let's take a look and think about what some of the potential benefits or potential harm might be if we are authentic in our teaching, to thinking about both ourselves as instructors and thinking about our students. So if we're inauthentic, what is the harm, right? So one, it could create this sort of atmosphere of distrust or frustration. Like if we go in with our plan search and it seems to work really well, and then students try it themselves and it doesn't work at all, they may become frustrated. They may feel like they are the ones doing something wrong, rather than the fact that it's really a complicated tool. We made it look easy, but it's not, right? And so we're creating frustration, or we're creating distrust. We're making them feel that they, they are the ones making mistakes when that's not really the case at all, right? They may feel like their authentic self is not good enough, right? So there could be some potential, harm to students if we don't sort of tell them the truth that research is a really complicated process and that it's really hard and it doesn't work very well all the time. And, we aren't always going to find the sources that we think we should find. And we struggle, we aren't always going to, if we're doing experimental research, we won't always get the results that we are hoping for. Right. And if we let students really know that and see how complicated this process actually is, they may be frustrated, right? And it may create more harm perhaps than good. As an instructor, I don't like telling them to use Discover. It makes me feel like a hypocrite, right? To tell them to do something that I don't do myself, right? Or maybe I feel lack of engagement because I have to teach them this, but I really don't think it's that important, or I don't like teaching about it, or whatever it is, right? We may be not, become a less engaged teacher if we are not able to be authentic. So those are some examples of potential harms that may come by not being authentic as a teacher. If we are, on the other hand, more authentic, maybe we are, if we provide them a more realistic perspective, right, that will validate their own experiences, right? Well, kind of, it's okay if you struggle. It's okay if you don't follow this exact specific process because I don't do it either, right? So maybe we can make it feel like, hey, you're doing fine as a researcher. You're doing, it's the same thing that everyone is doing. So thinking about that hidden curriculum of what really goes on when we are doing researcher, and we're sort of like raising the curtain for them and letting them to see behind the curtain, demystifying the experience so that they can see what it actually really looks like. And maybe that's a good thing, right? So that they truly understand what it is that they're getting into, their own experiences, and the challenges or struggles that they may have as researchers are validated. And they can develop their own research process that works for them. So that's some potential benefits of being authentic, but are there any potential harms that might come from being perhaps too authentic? I think someone had mentioned this, something like this in the chat. If we tell them that nothing like that this system doesn't really work very well, or that how hard this is, they may become disengaged, right? We already mentioned sometimes they just need those guardrails. They need that step-by-step process. They need to learn the rules. And then once they've done that, then they can go outside and doing that. But if they don't have that guidance first, then they actually may end up struggling more. If we're authentic ourselves as teachers, right, this can create friction, right, with our colleagues or with our administrators, with the faculty that we work with. Right, if we're saying that, I don't think that you should be teaching this, or I don't think that we should be teaching this, right? And maybe again, it's about that issue of when are we actually acting in the best interests of our students? It's easy to see a situation in which being dishonest is actually, acting in the best interest of your students. And if authenticity and honesty are the same thing, which is not really always clear, right? So potentially being too honest could be to the detriment of our students. If you go back to that definition that Lauren Bialstock had about authenticity being fundamentally being true to oneself, then it's also the case that that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to make you a good teacher. What if your true self, as she said, is quiet, risk-averse, and conformist, right? Right? Not everyone's true, authentic self is going to be, a fantastic teacher, a cutting-edge teacher, someone who's willing to take risks. Sometimes someone's true self is, I'm just going to go along with the rules, and that's because that's who I am. At the same time, right, and a person who is immoral or morally problematic could still be an authentic teacher, but that could have really negative results. And she gives the example, for example, of someone who is an unashamed racist, right? If that person is being their authentic self, they will let their students know that they are racist and they will share their racist beliefs. That is being authentic. But is that really what we want to see? In that case, we want that teacher to hide who they are, right? We don't want to know that they are. We don't want them to share those beliefs with their students, right? So just because a person is being authentic to who they are doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to be a good teacher. Likewise, it's possible that someone who is not inauthentic could still be a good teacher. And she gives the example, some folks my age, at least, will probably remember the movie Mr. Holland's Opus, which talks about a composer who goes into teaching only to make money, right? He has to pay the bills, but that's not who he really thinks he is. He does not think he's a teacher. He's a composer. He doesn't want to be there. And it's very clear at the beginning that he does not want to be a teacher, right? He ends up being a very good teacher and ends up loving teaching, but his original authentic self was not a teacher. And so, what does that mean for thinking about whether we want someone to really be who they are when they are teaching? All right. And then I also wanted to highlight just really quickly that, right, if being authentic means like disclosing things about yourself to your students, being honest, fully honest about who you are, that there are many situations where that is not safe for someone, right? And one example, for example, a teacher who comes out as gay or lesbian or bi or trans, they may feel that that's necessary to be an authentic teacher, but they may also be putting them in a situation where they could lose their job, right, their livelihood. They could put themselves in actual physical danger for doing that. And if someone, doesn't come out, does that mean that they are not authentic, right? So authenticity could be a virtue, but should that be a virtue that trumps all other virtues that folks might have? There may be very good reasons why someone is not able to be their authentic self when they are teaching. All right. So I'd love to hear thoughts that folks have on the potential benefits of being authenticity and the harms, where you might fall on this, and sort of how we might get around some of these issues or some dilemmas that are raised by this. So do the potential benefits of being authentic outweigh any potential harms? Yeah, great. Authenticity as truth based on who you are as a person, values, perspectives. Yeah, it's really great. So it's really interesting as you get into this sort of philosophical issue of what it actually means to be authentic and tying authenticity to identity. It makes it much more a complex question. Sometimes it depends on the audience. Yeah, great point, Renee. Is there much of a difference between authenticity and transparency? That is a really, really great question, Jamie. Some folks may say yes, some folks may say no, right? As we talked about, is it always necessary to be completely who you are when you are teaching? So knowing when it's appropriate to be authentic. Yeah. So I see a lot of folks' comments and folks are sharing in the chat about context and the situation, right? There may be situations where it's more appropriate to be more authentic, but there may be situations when it's not. Let's see. There's Ashley shared the times when I have leaned into being authentic, students engage more. I have found that the benefits outweigh the potential harm, but it really depends on the context. Liz shared, I think there are a lot of ways intentional authenticity can help support information literacy. It can be a way to model strategic processes. It's our job to provide explanations and context while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Right? Yeah. Great response. Yeah. So yeah, I see definitely a lot of folks talking, yeah, as I mentioned, right? It's about the situation, it's about the context. Darcy, I'm a person, but also a teacher. Great, that's, yeah, right? So Elizabeth shared about relationships. So to create a relationship with students, a certain amount of authenticity is required. And I think that's a really great point. If you are being fake, if you are putting on a performance, your students will often know, right? And that could create a barrier to you actually being able to create a relationship with someone. If trust is a foundation for a relationship and your students think that you are not being honest and candid and trustworthy, that may prevent you from creating a relationship. Yeah. Yeah, admit to students that I don't know everything about researching, and I sometimes consult colleagues. And I think that's a really great thing to do, Mary, for sure. All right. So to wrap us up, wanted to think about what the potential way forward might be with this topic. So thinking back to the initial scenario, some folks have already shared the response to this. So in that situation, when I'm there with the graduate students, what is something that I could do that could make my teaching more authentic? If you just want to share in the chat rather than going back out to the Padlet, you can do that too. And some folks have already shared some responses around there. But any ideas on what I could do in that situation that would make my teaching more authentic? Talk to students before class. Mm-hmm. So Renee shared present viable tools with preferences versus you must do that. Yes. So distinguish between, right, here's something that I'm maybe recommending versus here's, what I, explain to them what the discovery layer it is, how it works, but tell them that I like to search in different ways too and show them different ways. So it's not necessarily right that I show them the discovery system that is wrong. It's that if I show that is the only resource. But if I were to open it up and say, this is one of the tools that you can use. I don't necessarily use this myself, but here's the cases when it might be helpful to you to use it, right? And here's other ways that you can do it. So, creating a bigger picture rather than just saying this is what you have to use or this is what you need to do, right? Yeah. And so I think that aligns with exactly what I was saying, right? So, be honest, in the sense that, okay, maybe this tool doesn't always work as well as we would like, but explain to them, this is this is what this tool does. This is why I'm showing you this tool. Here's some situations when you might find it helpful to use this tool, but also opening it up and showing that there are other resources that they could also use as well, right? So not just leaving it to that one tool. Yeah. Listening to their opinions while guiding them. Yeah. Great. So the presentation that I saw at Leeds, the two presenters gave this idea of useful authenticity. So basically, they describe this as being as authentic as possible, but not to the detriment of your students and not to your own detriment. And thinking about the context, as folks have mentioned before, right? There may be situations where it's, with you all, I've been honest, right, about, that I don't necessarily think all of our tools work very well, but you all are not my students, right? And so in this situation, I am able to feel more comfortable being more authentic. Whereas if I was in a situation with students, I may feel less uncomfortable. So thinking about this as a situation of balance and context, considering in general authenticity to be a good thing, but recognizing that in all situations, that it's not always going to be the best thing. And there may be many reasons why at this particular stage, I may tell students to do something that I don't do myself. All right, so we have just a couple minutes left. I would love to hear it. If you all have any questions that you would like to share, any key takeaways that you're going to take from this workshop. As I mentioned, this is the first time I've done this one. And I would love to hear if you think that this was a really, if this was a helpful topic, useful discussion for you. So questions, comments, key takeaways that folks would like to share. You can add those to the chat. You can also, if you'd like to raise your hand, you can do that as well. Wonderful. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you. So Alicia shared it's useful because I'd like to hear how others feel about this topic. This has been helpful in confirming. Wonderful way to search through it. Thank you all. Thank you all so much. I really enjoyed having a chance to talk about this topic. And hearing all of your opinions, it was great to see. I'm sorry I didn't get to every comment in the chat because they were going so quickly. But it was great to see such engagement.